In the summer of 1765, on a sprawling Virginia plantation shadowed by tobacco fields and silence, a powerful master was found dead under mysterious circumstances, and before the sun had fully set on his body, orders were already spreading that no one was to investigate. Colonial Virginia in 1765 stood at a volatile crossroads. The colony was one of the most prosperous territories under the authority of the Kingdom of Great Britain, its wealth built upon tobacco exports and enslaved labor. Plantations stretched across fertile riverbanks, their grand houses overlooking fields worked by hundreds of enslaved men and women. The planter elite controlled local courts, militias, and political assemblies. Their authority flowed upward to the crown and downward through every layer of colonial society. That same year, unrest simmered across the colony over the newly imposed Stamp Act 1765. Public anger toward British taxation was rising. Influential figures such as Patrick Henry were challenging imperial authority in the House of Burgesses. Tension hung in the air. In such a climate, stability among the planter class was not merely social preference, but political necessity. The plantation master, at the center of this story, was among the wealthiest in his county. He owned vast acreage and dozens of enslaved workers. He also maintained close ties to regional officials and had connections that extended as far as London through tobacco merchants who financed colonial estates. His home functioned as both residence and informal seat of local power. Disputes were settled on his porch. Militia discussions took place in his dining hall. His word carried weight beyond his property lines. When his body was discovered, it lay at the base of the main staircase inside the plantation house. A pistol rested several feet away. Blood stained the polished wooden floor. At first glance, some whispered of accident. Others suspected suicide. But among the enslaved community and certain servants, quiet doubt spread quickly. The wound did not match the position of the weapon. Furniture had been disturbed. A decanter lay shattered near the doorway as though knocked aside during struggle. Before local magistrates could assemble formally, a small group of elite planters arrived at the estate. They closed ranks swiftly. The death, they announced, would be recorded as accidental. No coroner's jury would be convened. No enslaved person would be questioned publicly. The official ledger entry was brief and vague. Burial preparations began immediately. The speed of the decision raised suspicion among those who witnessed the scene. In colonial Virginia, even accidental deaths often warranted formal inquest, particularly when firearms were involved. Yet in this case, procedure was bypassed. The explanation offered was simple. The colony was already unstable due to political agitation over the Stamp Act. A scandal involving a leading planter could incite unrest or embolden critics of elite authority. Behind closed doors, however, there were other possible motives for suppression. The plantation master had accumulated significant debt to British merchants. Fluctuating tobacco prices had strained many estates. Letters recovered decades later suggest he was entangled in financial disputes that could have exposed irregular accounting practices. If foul play were connected to creditors or partners, a public inquiry might unravel networks of obligations stretching across the Atlantic. There were also tensions within the household. Accounts from enslaved workers passed down through oral tradition described violent temper and disputes over discipline. Some whispered that the master had quarreled fiercely with an overseer days before his death. Others believed a family disagreement had escalated. None of these claims were recorded officially. Enslaved testimony was rarely admitted in cases involving white elites, especially when such testimony threatened reputations. The colonial court, influenced heavily by the planter class, accepted the accidental verdict without challenge. Notices were sent to regional authorities affirming that no criminal act had occurred. Correspondence forwarded toward Britain emphasized continuity of estate management and reassured merchants in London that shipments would proceed without disruption. The enslaved population felt the consequences immediately. Patrols intensified. Movement was restricted. The message was clear. Whatever had happened inside the plantation house would not become a subject of speculation. Fear replaced curiosity. Silence was enforced not only by law but by the unspoken understanding that those who questioned authority risked brutal punishment. In the wider colony, political agitation continued. Debates over taxation and rights overshadowed private scandal. Figures like Patrick Henry captured public attention with fiery speeches. The death of a single planter, however powerful, faded from printed record. The plantation passed to a relative who maintained the official narrative and ensured that no re-examination of the case occurred. What remains today are fragments. A hurried burial entry, financial correspondence hinting at pressure from creditors, oral histories describing a struggle that official records deny. The refusal to investigate may reveal more than the cause of death itself. It exposes the fragility of a system in which elite solidarity could override legal process. In 1765 Virginia, authority depended on the appearance of unity among the planter class. At a time when colonial resistance to British policy was growing, public division among elites could have weakened their position. By suppressing inquiry, it preserved not only a reputation but a hierarchy. The plantation master's death became a shadow event, acknowledged briefly and then erased from scrutiny. Whether he was murdered by a rival, killed in a household conflict, or the victim of concealed financial dispute may never be known. What is clear is that from the moment his body was found, the most powerful men in the county agreed on one thing: no one was allowed to investigate. In the days following the burial, the plantation did not quiet, it tightened. The new acting master, a cousin who arrived with unusual speed from a neighboring county, assumed control before the soil above the grave had fully settled. He carried letters of authorization already signed and sealed, suggesting that contingency plans may have existed long before the death occurred. To the enslaved workers assembled in the yard, he delivered a brief address declaring continuity, discipline, and obedience. There would be no disruption to planting schedules, no changes to tobacco shipments, no tolerance for rumor. Yet rumor moved faster than orders. Among the enslaved community, whispers circulated about what had truly happened inside the main house. A cook claimed she heard shouting late into the night before the gunshot. A stable hand insisted he saw the overseer leave the residence with blood on his cuff. An older field worker quietly repeated that the master had been drinking heavily and arguing about debts tied to shipments bound for London. None of these voices would ever be called before a magistrate. Their accounts existed only in the fragile space of memory. The absence of a coroner's inquest remained the most glaring irregularity. In colonial Virginia, even lesser men were granted formal examination when death occurred under unclear circumstances. Juries were typically drawn from local freeholders. Evidence was presented, however superficially, but in this case, no such proceeding took place. The county clerk recorded the death as misadventure, an unfortunate accident involving mishandling of a pistol. The brevity of the entry was striking. Some members of the county militia privately questioned the decision. The master had been a figure of influence, often presiding over disputes and contributing to enforcement of British regulations, including recent measures connected to the controversial Stamp Act 1765. His death at a politically sensitive moment invited speculation. If the killing were deliberate and connected to anti-British agitation, suppressing investigation might prevent panic. If it were domestic conflict or debt-related violence, exposure could fracture elite unity. In either case, silence served the interests of those who governed locally. Financial records complicate the narrative further. Letters exchanged between the deceased planter and a tobacco factor in Britain referenced delayed payments and mounting obligations. Tobacco markets had fluctuated sharply. Credit lines extended by merchants were tightening. Some historians believe the plantation master faced potential ruin if creditors pressed claims aggressively. The cousin who assumed control promptly reorganized accounts, negotiating extensions and reassuring partners abroad that production would remain stable under new management. Such swift restructuring suggests that the death resolved more than a personal tragedy. It stabilized a financial network at risk of collapse. If scandal had erupted, creditors in Britain might have seized property or forced liquidation. The plantation's continuity protected not only family wealth but transatlantic investors. Meanwhile, political tension intensified throughout Virginia. Speeches inspired by figures like Patrick Henry challenged British authority and energized colonial assemblies. Public discourse focused on rights and taxation. In that climate, exposing internal violence among the planter elite would have weakened their moral posture. They presented themselves as guardians of order resisting imperial overreach. A murder within their ranks could undermine claims of disciplined leadership. The enslaved population bore the weight of enforced silence most heavily. Patrols doubled, night gatherings were restricted. Any suggestion that enslaved individuals might have been involved in the master's death triggered immediate threats. Although no official accusation was made, fear hung thickly over the quarters. The message was unmistakable. Questioning the narrative would invite punishment. Yet oral tradition refused to disappear entirely. Stories passed quietly from one generation to the next, describing the sound of struggle, the crash of broken glass, the abrupt arrival of armed neighbors before dawn. Some accounts suggested that the overseer, long resentful of the master's temper, had confronted him over withheld wages. Others hinted at a family dispute tied to inheritance or concealed relationships. The truth, fractured and unrecorded, survived only in pieces. What stands out most in this second chapter is not certainty about who pulled the trigger, but clarity about who controlled the aftermath. The planter class moved with unified purpose. They bypassed procedure, suppressed inquiry, and prioritized stability over transparency. In doing so, they demonstrated the mechanics of power in colonial Virginia. Law existed, but it bent easily when applied to those who wrote it. The plantation master's death became less an event than a boundary. On one side lay unanswered questions, on the other stood a carefully constructed silence. The fields continued to yield tobacco. Ships continued to sail for Britain. Political debates over taxation dominated public record, and beneath it all lingered the knowledge that in 1765 Virginia, certain truths were simply not permitted to surface. As months passed, the plantation settled into a rhythm that felt outwardly normal, yet something essential had shifted beneath the surface. The cousin who now governed the estate tightened every structure of control. Overseers were replaced, patrol routes redrawn, and written directives were copied into ledgers with deliberate precision, as if documentation itself could replace legitimacy. The enslaved community sensed that this new authority rested on fragile ground. It had arrived quickly, without ritual mourning, without communal reckoning, and without any official explanation that satisfied those who had heard the argument before the gunshot. Beyond the plantation gates, Virginia itself was transforming. News from the colonial capital in Williamsburg carried the language of resistance. Pamphlets denounced parliamentary taxation. Assemblies debated rights and representation. Influential voices, including Patrick Henry, argued that British measures threatened the liberties of free men. Planters who once prided themselves on loyalty began to adopt the vocabulary of defiance. They condemned external interference while maintaining rigid domination within their own estates. The irony did not go unnoticed among the enslaved. They listened to speeches delivered in the yard about liberty and tyranny, words that seemed to float above them without ever touching their own condition. The cousin adopted this rhetoric eagerly. He framed himself as a defender of colonial rights against distant authority in London. Yet inside the plantation boundaries, he exercised authority with unchallenged severity. Curfews were enforced more strictly than before. Tools were inventoried nightly. Informants were cultivated quietly, rewarded for reporting any conversation that hinted at dissent. It was during this tense season that a fragment of evidence nearly surfaced. A young indentured servant who had been present in the house on the night of the master's death confided in a traveling preacher. The servant described raised voices over debts and shipments, a heated accusation involving falsified weights of tobacco barrels, and a threat uttered in anger. The preacher, uneasy and uncertain how to proceed, mentioned the account to a minor county official. Within days, the servant disappeared from the plantation rolls. Officially, he had completed his term and departed westward. No forwarding location was recorded. Such disappearances were not unusual in an era of westward movement, but the timing raised quiet suspicion. The cousin publicly dismissed any suggestion of impropriety. He emphasized the need for unity during political unrest, insisting that colonial society must present strength to resist imperial pressure. A scandal within a prominent plantation family would fracture that unity. He framed silence as patriotism. Meanwhile, tobacco prices fluctuated unpredictably. Letters from British merchants conveyed cautious optimism, but demanded consistent quality and timely shipment. Any hint of instability could invite closer scrutiny of accounts. The plantation's books were rewritten with meticulous care. Figures were rounded, discrepancies reconciled, and earlier annotations quietly erased. What had once been messy correspondence now appeared orderly, as though chaos had never intruded. Among the enslaved elders, memory remained the only archive immune to revision. They spoke in guarded tones about the sound of a second voice, shouting the master's name, about the thud of boots on polished wood, about the unnatural calm of the household the following morning. They noted how quickly neighbors arrived, how efficiently decisions were made. To them, the absence of formal inquiry was itself proof of something deliberate. In the broader colony, tensions escalated toward open rebellion against Britain. Planters who decried external tyranny rarely examined their own structures of coercion. The cousin began attending meetings in Williamsburg, aligning himself with influential men who would soon shape revolutionary discourse. He positioned himself as a defender of liberty, carefully cultivating a public persona that erased the shadow of the unsolved death. Yet unresolved events have a way of resurfacing. A former overseer, dismissed shortly after the transition of power, began drinking heavily in a nearby county. In taverns, he hinted at secrets, suggesting that the gunshot had not been an accident. His claims were vague but provocative. Before any magistrate could summon him for questioning, he too vanished. Records note only that he departed for the frontier. By the end of the year, the plantation's narrative had hardened into official truth. The master died by misadventure. The cousin inherited authority. Production continued. Political agitation against Britain intensified. No formal challenge to the account survived in written form. Silence, reinforced by economic interest and political calculation, proved stronger than curiosity. What this third phase reveals is not merely the concealment of a single act, but the architecture of erasure. Power in colonial Virginia depended on cohesion among elites, on the seamless operation of plantations that fueled transatlantic trade, and on the suppression of any story that threatened that cohesion. The murder that nobody was allowed to investigate became absorbed into larger historical currents. As revolutionary language spread across Virginia, the unresolved death receded into shadow, its details preserved only in whispers, carried by those who possessed no legal standing to testify. By the time open resistance to Britain began to eclipse every other concern in Virginia, the plantation master's death had become a memory carefully trimmed of its sharpest edges. War rhetoric filled taverns and assembly halls. Committees of correspondence formed. Militia drilled in open fields. Men who had once debated taxes now spoke openly of independence. In that atmosphere, an old scandal carried little value unless it could be turned into political leverage. And this one could not. It implicated too many men whose unity was suddenly essential. The cousin who had assumed control of the plantation adapted quickly to the revolutionary tide. He attended county conventions, pledged support to colonial resistance, and contributed tobacco and funds to local militia supply. His public reputation strengthened with each visible act of patriotism. The narrative of the accidental death remained untouched, almost forgotten by those who found it inconvenient to remember. Yet the enslaved community did not forget. They watched white men argue passionately about liberty, while patrols intensified around slave quarters. They had speeches condemning distant authority, while their own movements were monitored more closely than ever. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The revolution promised freedom in principle, but on the plantation it translated into heightened discipline. Fear of internal rebellion increased as external conflict loomed. Rumors reached the estate that British officials were offering emancipation to enslaved people who fled rebel masters. The name of Lord Dunmore began circulating in whispers. His proclamation, issued in 1775, promised freedom to those who joined British forces against rebellious colonists. For the planter class, this was not only a military threat, but a direct challenge to their control over enslaved labor. The cousin responded by tightening restrictions further, determined that no one from his fields would escape and potentially expose vulnerabilities. In this charged environment, the master's unsolved death took on new meaning among the enslaved. Some began to interpret it as an early fracture in the authority that white planters claimed was absolute. Whether or not an enslaved person had been involved, the mere fact that a powerful master could die violently within his own home without public reckoning suggested limits to planter invulnerability. The story became a quiet symbol of hidden resistance, even if its true circumstances remained unknown. Meanwhile, the county's political leadership consolidated around revolutionary aims. Men who might once have questioned the irregularities of the death now stood shoulder to shoulder with the cousin in defense of colonial autonomy. To reopen the matter would risk weakening solidarity at a moment when unity was considered vital. The logic was simple. The enemy was Britain. not one of their own. Economic realities reinforced that logic. Tobacco shipments faced disruption as war intensified. Blockades and shifting trade routes threatened profits. The plantation required stable management to survive uncertainty. Credit arrangements with merchants in London grew more complicated as political ties frayed. Any hint of internal disorder could have jeopardized negotiations already strained by war. Silence protected not only reputation but survival. Years passed and the revolutionary cause hardened into full conflict. Younger men who had been boys at the time of the death now marched in militia units. The details of that night faded for many, replaced by larger narratives of battles and declarations. When independence was eventually secured, the new state government focused on building institutions rather than revisiting unresolved events from the colonial era. The absence of an investigation became permanent. The cousin, older now and firmly established as a respected local figure, rarely spoke of his predecessor. When asked casually about the incident, he repeated the same brief explanation recorded in the county ledger: an unfortunate accident, a tragic mishap, nothing more. His confidence rested on the knowledge that official documents supported him. No coroner's report existed to contradict his version. No witness statements had been preserved. The archive was silent. But silence in official records does not erase lived memory. Among descendants of the enslaved community, the story persisted in fragments. They remembered the argument before the gunshot. They remembered the hurried arrival of armed neighbors. They remembered how quickly power shifted. In their telling, the murder that nobody was allowed to investigate became part of a larger understanding of how justice functioned in colonial Virginia. Law operated fully for some and selectively for others. By the end of the century, the plantation had changed hands again, sold to satisfy debts accumulated during wartime disruptions. The original master's grave remained on a small rise overlooking the fields. The stone bore a simple inscription and a date. No hint of controversy marked it. Visitors would see only the outward sign of a planter who died in the mid-18th century. They would not see the concealed struggle that followed, nor the deliberate decision to prevent inquiry. What endures from this final chapter is the pattern. A violent death occurred. Procedure was bypassed. Political and economic interests aligned to enforce silence. Revolution came and reshaped the colony, yet it did not disturb that earlier concealment. The master's murder slipped quietly into the margins of history, preserved not in court transcripts or official investigations, but in the guarded memories of those who had no recognized voice. Decades later, when the plantation house had weathered into a faded relic of another era, the story of the master's death existed in two separate worlds. In the official world of parchment and seal, it remained an accident recorded in a single restrained sentence. In the other world, carried through memory rather than ink, it was remembered as something far more deliberate, a moment when the illusion of unquestioned authority cracked, and then was carefully sealed again. The new American Republic that emerged after independence prided itself on law, representation, and constitutional order. Virginia's leaders spoke eloquently about rights and governance. Some of them would help shape the nation itself, including figures like Thomas Jefferson, whose words about liberty would echo for centuries. Yet within counties and plantations, local power often operated according to older habits. Social rank, wealth, and family alliances still determined which events were examined and which were quietly buried. As generations passed, the cousin who inherited control became a respected elder. His participation in revolutionary committees granted him a reputation as a patriot. That status hardened over time into local legend. The unresolved death that had once threatened to complicate his authority transformed into a footnote that few dared to revisit. Those who might have questioned it were either gone or absorbed into the same networks of influence that had suppressed inquiry from the beginning. The enslaved community, however, preserved a different narrative. In their retellings, the master's final night symbolized a rare disruption in a rigid system. Some believed he had been killed by someone inside the house. Others believed it was a confrontation over debts or betrayal among white elites. What mattered most was not certainty about the identity of the killer, but the recognition that power had limits, even if those limits were hidden from official sight. Over time, the plantation itself declined. Soil exhaustion reduced tobacco yields. Markets shifted, ownership changed, buildings decayed. The grave on the small rise overlooking the fields weathered under rain and wind. Moss crept across the carved letters. Visitors no longer connected the name on the stone with any living controversy. The absence of documentation ensured that no historian of the early Republic could easily reconstruct what had happened. The archive offered nothing beyond the sparse county entry. When 19th-century chroniclers compiled local histories, they focused on battles, elections, and prominent families. They cited speeches delivered in Williamsburg and resolutions passed in assembly. They rarely mentioned private violence within plantation walls. The murder that nobody was allowed to investigate did not fit the triumphant narrative of patriotic unity and orderly governance. It contradicted the image of stable leadership guiding Virginia toward independence. Yet patterns reveal themselves in absence. Scholars examining plantation records later noticed the abrupt transfer of authority, the rewritten account books, the disappearance of certain names from labor rolls. These irregularities hinted at a deeper story, though proof remained elusive. The silence that protected the planter class in 1765 proved remarkably durable. It survived revolution, constitutional change, and generational turnover. In the end, the significance of the event lies not in identifying a specific hand that pulled a trigger, but in understanding the system that ensured no hand would ever be publicly named. Colonial Virginia possessed legal mechanisms for inquiry. Coroners, juries, and magistrates existed. They functioned effectively when the accused lacks power, but when elite cohesion, economic stability, and political ambition aligned, those mechanisms could be set aside without protest. The plantation master's grave still stands in imagination as a marker of that selective justice. It represents a moment when the law bent to protect reputation and wealth. It reflects a society capable of demanding accountability from distant rulers while withholding it from itself. And it reminds us that historical silence is often constructed, not accidental. Thus the story closes not with revelation but with recognition. The murder was never officially investigated. The record remains thin. The truth rests somewhere between fragmentary memory and deliberate omission. In that space, the past continues to whisper about power, secrecy, and the choices that shape what history chooses to remember.